Hi, and welcome to the Grieving with God podcast. I'm your host, Dawn Byington. And today we are welcoming Adam Sanders. And if you remember a few weeks ago, actually, I think it was a few months ago now, we had Kelsey Sanders on as she spoke about her blood disorder and her journey with grief. And so today we have Adam on, who's going to talk about the other side of that, which is spousal support or any support role, really, when it comes to grief. Grieving with someone who is grieving something like this. And so, Adam, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Adam and I know each other. We've known each other for about 10 years. We both work in theater and we work with children. So it's exhausting and rewarding.
Yep. Accurate.
Very excited to have him here. So Adam, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and then how you and Kelsey met?
Yeah, so I am the artistic director of Spartanburg Youth Theater, which is where Don and I initially met, and then we met at church as well. But so I supervise the entire program. I program the season. I teach classes. I direct shows. I hire staff to direct. I just kind of a little bit of everything. And so I've been in that position for this November will be 10 years, which is so wild. I know. We met when I was still just a guest director there. And so
Right.
then I got the position in November of 2015. So
And
almost 10 years.
We went to the same church.
No.
Because the church is kind of big and we had not been going to the same campus.
Yep.
And then I walk into church one day, I think it was like at the Sunday after the Saturday I met you, and I was like, what? So
I know. And like those moments, like I've never told you, I don't know if I've told you this, but those moments where you're like, is that person a believer? Like you're pretty sure they are, but you don't know for sure. And then we met that was just a fun moment where I was like, oh, wow. Because in the arts, as you and I know, it's very rare to find believers and or faithful believers who aren't kind of that worldly idea of, God. So, yeah. So it was at church, that Kelsey and I actually met too. So Kelsey and I were just in our first community group together. We both started going there like 2014, and then we were assigned the same community group. And so we knew each other really for, it was like 5 or 6 years before we ever started dating. And just good friends, like really thought very highly of each other, always enjoyed each other's presence. I had a lot of growing, and the Lord had a lot of work on me before I was ever even like willing to even consider dating. I mean, early on, this is a different podcast episode, but I wasn't even sure I wanted to be married. But so it took a long time for the Lord to really work in my heart, and through community there. Long story short, we made it. We got together. We started dating, and we stayed for about a year, and then we've been married since 2020.
My question for you was, before you guys got married, did you or were you aware of what she was struggling with in the disorder that she had?
Yeah. So because of, at our church, community is really strong, and its vulnerability is really encouraged. And so we knew, our group knew a lot of Kelsey's story. Actually, early on in the first year of our community group, Kelsey had relapsed. And it was a pretty minor, relapses are still scary, but she recovered pretty quickly from that relapse. But so I was pretty aware of her disease. I didn't know all the ins and outs of it, but I had known basically since I'd known her, pretty early into knowing her about her disease. And so once we started dating, I learned more of how her disease worked. But yeah, I've known about her disease for mostly as long as I've known her.
And so, we know that with this disorder, getting sick, it can be a very scary thing for her. And you guys are getting married in the midst of COVID.
It was awful.
Yeah.
It was, and that was kind of the first time, like she had learned how to function through like colds and things like that throughout the years, but with a novel disease to the body, it was very scary. And this was we were only engaged, so we weren't living together yet. We were navigating engagement through a pandemic and trying to figure out how to navigate all of that. And so, that was really scary. And it was actually COVID that she got it, and that's what triggered her relapse. And we were only like 3-4 months into marriage when she relapsed.
And so tell me a little bit about that relapse. How was that different from the minor one?
Yeah, so she had actually, that was her fourth relapse. So
Mhm.
she had the disease for 16 years. And that relapse, a couple months into marriage, she just never recovered from. So she got a kind of a type of chemo treatment called ATG that normally, once you get that treatment, within a few months, your blood counts start to rise back up. And, or at least in the past 3 times, that's how it worked. But this time, she just never recovered. Her counts never really got much higher than, I mean, much higher at all.
Mhm.
Um, and then towards the end there, I mean, I would say that relapse lasted a good 2 years. Like she never really fully came out of it.
Wow.
And towards the end of that, she started to have to get blood transfusions a good bit. I mean, it was just, yeah, she just never, her body never responded as well to that treatment then.
And so you're newly married, you're navigating that, which is a whole other thing. Learning to live with each other and deal with each
Yes.
other's quirks, which were so cute when you were dating. You know,
Yeah.
you're in the midst of this pandemic, and she's having this relapse. Yep, having this
Relapse.
relapse.
Yeah.
Um, how? So now we know that this is more of like a grieving process. We are grieving. And
Mm.
Kelsey kind of talked about this ambiguous grief where like people around you aren't
Yeah.
really seeing the day to day what's going on with you guys, how you're
Mm.
feeling emotionally. So, how did this grieving process affect you emotionally as her support person? And did you feel like you were able to really grieve alongside her while she was also grieving?
Mm. So do you mean specific to the relapse or the
Um,
transplant as well? Just kind of all of it.
Both. I guess we're going to talk about the transplant as well. So yeah, the
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
relapse. Going through all of this new stuff in the beginning, and then later on with her transplant, which became a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk more about the transplant. So I'll talk first with the grieving of the relapse season. That was for caretakers, I that in some ways is just so key to how God designed me. Like in a lot of ways, I was in my element. I love caring for people, and I have very much that's just like a piece in me that is the Lord's been developing and seeing. So in a lot of ways, at first, I didn't know I was grieving because I was just like serve, 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 take
Yes.
care of her. There were tons of doctor's appointments. I was taking off work to take her to transfusions. Um, it was just very clear what I needed to do. And so I think in some ways I kind of got lost in the
Mhm.
caretaker of it all and forgot to even consider how I was feeling or to even check in. I mean, I thought I was fine, and then I remember it was probably she had the treatment in like April or May. I feel like it was late into fall that year when I just was in a
Mhm.
funk and I couldn't figure out what was wrong, and I it just over time became clear to me that I was like so angry with God, but I had not even taken time to process my feelings, how it
Mhm.
affected me. And I mean, gosh, on top of it all, it was our first year of marriage. I mean, we were literally figuring out who we are together amidst all of this hardship. So it was a lot. I mean, but I think the grief was hidden by I was just you were just doing. I was like, all right, doctor's appointments, food, make sure this is
Mhm.
happening, and so I didn't even know I needed to grieve. It was something new for
So as a
me.
caretaker, um, you said earlier on, you said to me that you didn't even know, you didn't understand what it meant to grieve properly. And I think, and what I hear is like us caretakers, like you said, there's a list, there's things to do. We are going to comfort the person, who is precious to us or who we're working with, and we
Yes.
forget about ourselves and we forget about our needs. And so, can you kind of talk about what you mean by grieving properly?
I think the first thing is like identifying that it's affecting you too. I think one thing I'm really bad about is to be like, Kelsey's the one who went through this. Like, sure, I went through stuff, but like Kelsey's, and it's true. She's the one whose body betrayed her. She's the one who went through a transplant and had to feel all of those things. But like, it affects the spouse. Um, I don't know. I don't know if I'd say equally, but just differently for sure. I mean, I do think equally. You're both going through it together. It's just different. It looks different with each of you. So, um, yeah, I think that like acknowledging that it is affecting you too was a piece of grief for me actually, because once I acknowledged, oh, this is really hard, then the emotions came out, and then I started to understand, okay, there's something here that I haven't processed through. Um, and yeah, I think that was kind of one big huge step is like, yes, spouses going through it are
Mhm.
affected significantly, and making sure that we take some time because Kelsey noticed, but Kelsey's feeling horrible, so she doesn't have the energy to check in on me. She doesn't have the energy to make sure I'm okay, and so and then that affected her too. So um, that was one big huge piece I think for me starting to learn that, and then I think um, how I learned to grieve was I don't know. I feel like it looks different for every person. I think grief is like it's not just, I mean, I feel like I used to think grief was just like, oh, cry about it. We talked about this a little bit ago before we started filming. Cry about it and then move on. Great, we're done. Um, and for me, the Lord has made me uniquely to be a connected person with other people. Like I get energized by being around others. I can hang out with friends and then I'll be wide awake for 2 hours afterwards because it
Right.
just energizes me. Whereas, Kelsey does the same thing and that's most of her social battery and then she's got to go to bed. Um, so I think grief for me has been processing it with other
Mhm.
close, specifically brothers in Christ in this case, because I needed to be able to process through all of those emotions. But Kelsey was not the appropriate person to lay all of my grief on because she was processing her own grief and having to live through her body betraying her. So, grief, I also had to learn our spouse is our person, it's our number one go to. But in this specific instance, she couldn't be the person I laid all this
Yeah.
on.
So, what did you learn was appropriate things in this kind of a season? I mean, and it is probably specific to you and your situation, but someone listening might say, "Oh, I didn't think about that." That I can't
Yeah,
just verbal vomit on my spouse when we're grieving the same thing.
right.
Um, we are all
Yeah.
grieving differently, and I talk a lot of my guests. We've talked about that. Husbands, wives, they grieve very differently. Um,
Hmm.
but it is hard when that person that you're the closest to can't really be that person you you know vent on or whatever during this kind of. So how did you find
Yeah.
out, or what did you feel was appropriate or not appropriate to share with her during this season?
I mean, it definitely was some trial and error. And I think first and foremost, it was important for us to like know that each other had the freedom to say, I really want you to process this. I don't know that I can be the person that can be that. I think specifically for me, if it was like, yeah, I like anyone was worried that she
Mm,
wasn't going to live.
yeah.
I don't need to
Yes.
process that with her.
Hmm.
Um, I needed to be able to mourn that we may not be able to have kids. And that is an unfair thing to put on her because she's mourning that too. So heavy. I mean, and that's specific to our situation, and I don't know what marker you put on that, but those are like really heavy things that are examples for me that like I need to process with someone else that I was scared of losing her. And at points and times, it was helpful for her to hear those things, but I think like, um, I don't know, we had to just really feel it out. But those were kind of examples of things like that were just too heavy for her to carry and unfair of me to put on her.
Hmm.
Another example would be when she was having her transplant and we lived in Georgia for 2 months. Her parents came and lived there too, and processing through complications with dealing with in-laws. That was unfair to put on her. So those are kinds of some examples of things that she is literally just trying to live, like she is literally fighting every day to just stay alive. And especially in that early transplant stage, I mean, her body was so vulnerable because they wiped out her immune system. And so she was just to then put on her, hey, I'm scared that you're not going to make it. That is just, that's not for her.
Well, there's a
You know?
buzzword going on
Yeah.
in social media, or buzzwords, which is called mental load, so in the counseling circles, they're talking about mental
Yes.
load, and they're talking about, they call them the man babies, where they're like, husband, if you come home and you ask your wife, does the dishwasher need to be emptied, when clearly it needs to be emptied, just do it.
Right. Yeah.
Don't put that mental load on someone else when you can figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not quite the same thing, but I think it's the same terminology. Like, we don't want to overload the mental load of the person who is going through this process.
Yeah.
We're grieving alongside
Mm-hmm.
them, and yes, part of this grief, because you're grieving the fact that you might lose your wife, right? And maybe there is
Mm-hmm.
another time, maybe there's a counseling session, maybe there's a safer place where
For
that
sure.
could be expressed. But like you said,
Mm-hmm.
that's a heavy, heavy load to put on somebody who's already trying to just survive. And so, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think it was helpful for her to know I am processing through this with others, because she wanted to know that I was not stuffing it down. And so the most I would tell her sometimes would just be like, yeah, we talked about how this is really hard on me, and that was good enough for her. She's like, okay, good. I'm glad that you are, because she worried about me. I mean, a lot, and it was helpful. I think it was just good for her to see I am processing this and I am walking through this grief, even though it can't be with you right now.
And being honest with your spouse that that's what you're doing, So were there any moments during her grief that felt maybe overwhelming to witness, or how did you navigate some of these hard times where she was grieving and she needed that support?
Yeah. I think one to clarify, like there weren't many things that were hard. I mean, with the caretaker in this situation, I was comfortable for her unloading everything.
Yes.
There were very few things. I don't know. I can't think of anything that I was okay. Like, I wanted her unload to me. She was scared of dying. I wanted her, like, that was perfectly fine for me to handle. It was just because she's the one going through it. It wasn't appropriate for me to load that on her,
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I just thought about that. And so I think that's definitely kind of the basis that, when she would start to just process with me, I'm a fixer by nature. And so it became very clear early on that, like, she wasn't asked, like, the only one who can fix circumstances is the Lord. The only one who can really give us any hope or, just real lasting change is Him. And so for me to try to, like, diminish how she felt really had to do with my own discomfort. Like, if she was expressing frustration with the Lord and how the Lord works and the Lord's power, if I immediately was like, well, no, we need to remember this and this and this, I realized it was because I was uncomfortable at questioning the Lord's character. I was uncomfortable. Like, she was able to process at a level that was actually really healthy that I wasn't comfortable with. And so I had to learn, like, I don't need to offer a solution. And anytime I would try to do that, she would feel so unseen and she would feel so frustrated. Like, her body's betraying her, and she just needed someone who is safe, who she knows that can hear her fears and allow her to just process them, because the Lord processed all of that. I mean, the reality is, no question I could have asked or advice I could have given could have done what the Lord has done in the past year and a half. What she has done to process her grief, the clarity she has on the Lord's character, the clarity she has on her story, all of that the Lord did. So I didn't need to ask. I didn't need to give any advice because the Lord has been doing that through His word, through professionals, and so that's kind of what I learned with grief, is that, like, she just needed a safe place to land and to just be able to share and express. So
when I talk with a lot of women who are grieving, that seems to be like one of the things we really hunger for, which is to be seen. Because grieving, a lot of times, especially if you're grieving, a miscarriage, or I'm grieving the loss of my mother, but not my spouse's mother, or, we're grieving something, we can feel sometimes like we're drowning. because grief can be so heavy and overwhelming sometimes, and we feel so isolated. Nobody else is feeling this. Nobody else is seeing this. Nobody understands the weight. And I think having someone, a spouse, a friend, a caretaker, somebody who you can, like, she felt comfortable coming to you, unloading to you, and you in return made her feel seen. And that is probably the greatest gift you could give someone who's grieving, is to just, I'm seen. Thank God I can take a breath now. And I'm not holding all of this by myself. I'm not alone. And I think that's a lot of times that's what we feel when we're grieving, is that we feel like we're alone.
Absolutely. And it makes us even feel more alone when someone immediately tries to solve it for us, right? Like, even, there are just, throughout my time processing through my own grief, like I had to learn, I think that's an interesting sidebar, is I had to learn the right people to grieve with. There were people I very quickly learned, it's not this person. They couldn't, they diminished, in trying to help, they made me feel guilty for being angry, all these kinds of things. And so, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I think we've all been in a place where we're just trying to feel seen, and then someone like immediately diminishes us by trying to, I don't know, give unsolicited advice or whatever.
And I want to come back to that. We're going to come back to that question about, the advice you might give to somebody, some, things they can and cannot do, things they should and shouldn't say. And we'll talk about, you talked about how you've been wounded. You and Kelsey were wounded by some experiences you had with other people. So I definitely want to come back to that. In your own grief, what were some of the emotions or maybe experiences you had with God, with, in this process of everything you were going through? I guess, how was your walk with God? What were some of the things maybe you felt towards him, and how did you process that?
So, in Kelsey's relapse, anger was one that I had never really processed through, never really admitted to him how angry I was, that he allowed this to happen to her, that he allowed this in our first year of marriage, all of those things. And so expressing anger and just letting it out. And, it's not, I think I used to think, okay, get mad, have your little hissy fit, and then move on. But like, I had to sit for weeks and months and approach the Lord while I was still angry with him, and allow that relationship to grow. But I think it's like the safety that was there and is there. I never was reprimanded for my doubt, that's not my experience. And I feel like Kelsey and I have heard some people speak, and it's just not been our experience. So I can't speak for others, but yes, there is time for the Lord's correction. Yes, there is time for his fierce discipline in areas that need to be, but us questioning him and being angry with him amidst just really hard circumstances, he only ever responded to us with compassion and love, And so I don't know what to say about that other than that was our experience there,
Well, I think it's important for people to see, hey, that anger is a natural, normal reaction, right? It's a reaction to pain and suffering and being angry with God, because we know he is the sustainer. He is the creator. He is sovereign. So if this is happening to me, he knows about it. And if he knows about it, why aren't you doing something about it?
Yes. Right.
And so I think it's good for us to see, hey, other people have had this reaction. I know when we first heard about Ezekiel, that was one, and I'm going to be talking about this on a mini episode soon, is that one of the reasons that started me writing and journaling and talking to other people was that every resource I found about grieving as a Christian pretty much ignored any feeling that wasn't joy and hope and praise and glory to God. And I was like, I felt so alone because I was so angry trying to understand what was happening to us. And I was like, these people are telling me that I can't come to God because I have to be happy and joyful for everything. And I'm like, when I think about that, and I talked to another guest earlier about this, is I think about Thomas when Jesus came back, and Thomas, they were all telling Thomas that he was raised from the dead, and he said, I don't believe it. He goes, I won't believe it until I can see it and touch his hands and touch the scars. I don't believe it. And Jesus didn't come in and reprimanded him. He actually
Yes.
invited him to come and touch his hands and his feet. Like, he
Yes.
invited him to assuage his doubt, like put his doubts aside and say, no, Thomas, it's okay. You can come to me. I know you're doubting,
Yeah.
but come and I'll
Mm.
show you what I'm doing. So I do think that, and I love these
Yes.
stories where people feel the safety of coming to their Father God because they know He's inviting them to feel all these emotions. He's going to be able to handle it. And He knows if
Mm.
we are coming and leaning in deeper with Him, He's going to be able to reveal things to us and deepen our relationship. And so that was my question. The next question was,
Yeah.
how in this anger, in this frustration and grief, did you keep that foundation of the Lord?
Mm. Yeah, I think he just it deepened our relationship. Think about like your first fight with your spouse, and it's scary, and I didn't have a very stable home life, and fighting with mom and dad fighting was common, and it did not end in resolution and did not end well. So that was tough for me, but then our first big argument, we got through it and we continued to love each other, and we realized she wasn't going anywhere, I wasn't going anywhere. It actually deepened our
Yeah.
relationship,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's the best analogy I have for how it worked with my relationship with the Lord, is that
Yep.
expressing more and being more honest and having those kinds of feelings just deepened things. Because I think what's interesting is the transplant, which was about 2 to 3 years after the relapse, I didn't struggle with anger with him this time. I mean, I struggled with a lot of doubt and fear and worry, but anger wasn't there. But it just, like, I don't know, there's just a deepness there. That time in Georgia when we were there, and just throughout the whole transplant, like, I look back and I can't believe I didn't just lose. I mean, I had some emotional breakdowns. I definitely had moments that were so difficult. I remember reading in my journal that I said, like, Lord, this is too much. Like, I cannot bear this. But when I look back in hindsight, the richness and deepness when it came to my relationship with him was just there. I didn't, I was worried. I didn't know what he was going to do, but I just knew he had us. And whatever that looked like, I feel like I hear that sometimes, and what I think people mean is like, I just knew he was going to heal her. I didn't. I did not know that the transplant was going to work. I did not know she was going to be cured. I didn't know that, but I knew whatever was there was okay. And it's easy for me to say that now on the other end, knowing that the transplant did work and knowing that she is doing well. But in the moment, I felt security and peace from him, regardless of how I knew if the transplant would work or not. And so I think I really do think it had to do with that season a year or so before, where I really had to process through anger with him and grief with him and all of that.
It's a hard road, but you're right. When other trials come after that kind of processing, it's different. Your walk with him,
It's
the way
different.
you lean on him and come to him is different. So
join us next week for the rest of Adam's story. We are trying something new on the Grieving with God podcast. I'm trying to keep our podcasts under 30 minutes. I realize some of our interviews are much longer than that, and the content is so rich and so good, I'd hate for you to miss any of it. And come back next week to hear the rest of what Adam has to say. We ask that you subscribe and like and share this podcast so other people can find it. We'll see you next time on the Grieving with God podcast.